Standing on the shoulders of giants. The phrase standing on the shoulders of giants is a metaphor which means using the understanding gained by major thinkers who have gone before in order to make intellectual progress. It is a metaphor of dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants, Latin nanos gigantum humeris insidentes, and expresses the meaning of discovering truth by building on previous discoveries. This concept has been dated to the 12th century and, according to John of Salisbury, is attributed to Bernard of Chartres. But its most familiar and popular expression occurs in a 1675 letter by Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Early references: Middle Ages, an unknown attribution to Bernard of Chartres from John of Salisbury in 1159. John wrote in his Metallogicon, Bernard of Chartres used to compare us to dwarfs perched on the shoulders of giants. He pointed out that we see more and farther than our predecessors, not because we have keener vision or greater height, but because we are lifted up and borne aloft on this. However, according to Umberto Eco, the most ancient attestation of the phrase dates back to Priscian cited by Guillaume de Conches. According to medieval historian Richard William Southern, Bernard was comparing contemporary 12th century scholars to the ancient scholars of Greece and Rome. A similar conceit also appears in a contemporary work on church history by Ordericus Vitalis. The phrase sums up the quality of the cathedral schools in the history of learning, and indeed characterizes the age which opened with Gerbert 950-1003 and Fulbert 960-1028 and closed in the first quarter of the 12th century with Peter Abelard. The phrase is not a great claim, neither, however, is it an example of abasement before the shrine of antiquity. It is a very shrewd and just remark, and the important and original point was the dwarf could see a little further than the giant. That this was possible was above all due to the cathedral schools with their lack of a well-rooted tradition and their freedom from a clearly defined routine of study. Religious texts. Modern references. Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton remarked in a letter to his rival Robert Hooke dated 5 February 1675, "What Descartes did was a good step. You have added much several ways, and especially in taking the colours of thin plates into philosophical consideration. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." This has recently been interpreted by a few writers as a sarcastic remark directed at Hooke's appearance. Although Hooke was not of particularly short stature, he was of slight build, and had been afflicted from his youth with a severe kyphosis. However, at this time Hooke and Newton were on good terms, and had exchanged many letters in tones of mutual regard. Only later, when Robert Hooke criticized some of Newton's ideas regarding optics, was Newton so offended that he withdrew from public debate. The two men remained enemies until Hooke's death. Others. Diego de Estella took up the quotation in the 16th century. By the 17th century it had become commonplace. Robert Burton, in the second edition of the Anatomy of Melancholy 1624, quotes Stella thus: "I say with Didacus Stella, a dwarf standing on the shoulders of a giant may see farther than a giant himself." Later editors of Burton misattributed the quotation to Lucan. In their hands Burton's attribution Didacus Stella in Luke 10, Tom. Roman II Didacus on the Gospel of Luke, Chapter 10, Volume 2 became a reference to Lucan's Pharsalia 2.10. No reference or allusion to the quotation is found there. In 1634, Marin Mersenne quoted the expression in his Questions Harmoniques, "Comme allons dit, il est bien facile, and mes me nécessaire de voir plus loin que nos devanciers, lors que nous sommes montés sur leurs épaules." Blaise Pascal, in the preface to the treatise on the vacuum, expresses the same idea, without talking about "c'est de là que nous pouvons découvrir des choses qu'il leur était impossible de percevoir. Notre vue est plus détendue, et quoiqu'ils connaissent aussi bien que nous tout, si qu'ils pouvaient remarquer de la nature, ils en connaissaient pas tant ni moins, et nous voyons plus qu'eux." Later in the 17th century, George Herbert, in his Jacula Prudentum 1651, wrote a dwarf on a giant's shoulders sees farther of the two. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in The Friend 1828, wrote, "The dwarf sees farther than the giant, when he has the giant's shoulder to mount on." Against this notion Friedrich Nietzsche argues that a dwarf, the academic scholar, brings even the most sublime heights down to his level of understanding. In the section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra 1882 entitled On the Vision and the Riddle, Zarathustra climbs to great heights with a dwarf on his shoulders to show him his greatest thought. Once there, however, the dwarf fails to understand the profundity of the vision, and Zarathustra reproaches him for making things too easy on himself. If there is to be anything resembling progress in the history of philosophy, Nietzschean Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks 1873 writes, "It can only come from those rare giants among men, each giant calling to his brother through the desolate intervals of time, an idea he got from Schopenhauer's work in Der Handschriftliche Nachlass." Contemporary references